Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the Bluestein Family Foundation, the Joan Gans CUNY and Peter G. Peterson Fund, Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Malkin Fund, the May and Samuel Rudin Family Foundation, the Joanne and Kenneth Wellner Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America. I'm Richard Heffner, your host on The Open Mind, and perhaps particularly because I myself am such an admitted economic illiterate, it pleases me no end that Eduardo Porter, who writes the Economic Scene column for the New York Times, joins me here today. Now, formerly my guest was a member of the Times editorial board, where he wrote about business, economics, and a mix of other matters related to the dismal science that intrigue me, but often surpass my pay grade in just plain comprehension, though surely not in interest. He is the author, too, of Penguin's The Price of Everything. Now, we record this conversation just 2 days after the 2012 presidential election, and but a week after my guest titled a New York Times piece, "At the Polls, Choose Your Capitalism." And I want to ask him both what he meant by that and, without interfering with his electoral choice, what choice he would make. Thanks for joining me, but I have to ask you that question.
Well, thanks for having me. Well, first, what I meant, the United States has chosen a particular form of engaging in capitalism, with the world, with globalization, with technology, that is fairly unique, fairly different from that of many other developed countries in Europe, Japan, Australia, Canada. And this is a choice that I think came up in this election in kind of like a condensed, very specific form, because you had one candidate that was proposing perhaps something more like what I would characterize the road that we have taken over the past 30 years, which was Republican Mitt Romney, who was proposing a less government in our society, a smaller government that did fewer things, that entailed then therefore lower taxes and more, private initiative. At least that was a way that I think he couched much of his proposition as a president in terms of the economy. And on the other hand, President Obama was suggesting more of what, and his critics would say this actually, was more of the choices that other social democracies have made, which is where the government is believed to have a substantial role to play in addressing, many of our social ills and dysfunctions, from offering universal health care to more extended unemployment insurance. I mean, so this kind of like proposition came forth in this election, but it is representative of the kind of different paths that we have taken compared to a bunch of other countries.
But it seems to me so strange that no one or few people, that's why I picked on your column, because I was so impressed with it. I thought back to FDR, and I thought back to his great Commonwealth Club speech, and he was talking about saving capitalism,
yes, that
the New Deal actually did save it. But not many politicos this year or in recent years have made the point that you make so well.
Well, but I think in a way FDR was right. In fact, yesterday, an economist from the University of Oregon, Mark Thoma, wrote this great piece. This one was about Hurricane Sandy, but the point that he was trying to make was the same point that you're alluding to, that you need to save capitalism from its excesses, and that the idea that government can play a role there is crucial to understand. If the kind of inequities that build up if there is no kind of like countervailing force, could ultimately destroy support for capitalism. It could destroy the kind of trust that you need for capitalism to function.
Do you think there was purpose in President Obama's reluctance to pursue this point of view? Because it wasn't really pursued.
Yes, I think you're right. Yes, and it's because, you know, this road that we've taken was not just did not just come up in this election. This choice. This is a choice that we've been making over decades. I mean, I would put it back to roughly 1980, where the idea that government should be smaller started taking hold in the political discussion in this country. And, you know, so for a very, very long time, the main thrust of you know, the political discourse has moved towards smaller government, fewer taxes, less regulation. All these things have been proposed as a good thing, conducive to more economic growth, to more creativity, to more innovation. And that's pretty much the road that we've followed, at least compared to other countries.
As an economist, you don't agree with that point of view, do you?
Well, it's a road that we chose to take as a democratic society. We could have chosen others. Maybe I would choose another. But the fact is that I think that the road that we have taken, the empirical fact, has, I think, produced a bunch of social dysfunctions that, had we given government a larger role, would not be so dire. So I'm talking about, you know, child mortality rates that are very, very high compared to other rich countries, infant mortality rates, maternal mortality rates, teen obesity, births to teenagers. I mean, we are at the kind of like at the bad end of many, many kind of like social indicators. And it's surprising for a country as rich as ours, as, you know, as ultimately very prosperous country on average, to show these kinds of dysfunctions.
Do you think that the president will now that he's not a candidate for anything, he's won, after all, the Nobel Peace Prize, so that in his post-presidential years, that's not a possibility or a likelihood. Do you think that the president will push that point of view, that level of understanding?
I mean, I would say that the proposal for the health reform
Yeah.
effort was a very substantial push in this direction. I mean, there's lots of people that are unhappy at how it ended up, that there are people who wanted the government to be the single provider of health care and would prefer to, you know, a solution more like that in Britain and other European countries where the government provides health care. This was more of a hybrid, but it was a very big push in the direction of government provision of kind of like basic social services. And you know, I would expect that that would be the thrust of his second term. In terms of the kind of the rhetoric he will use to deliver it, maybe it will be more forceful. But that's kind of like more of a political analysis that I'm not really very qualified to do. But I do hear that maybe the gloves are off, and the attempt at being as bipartisan as possible is no longer going to be part of the mix in a second administration.
But of course, all the things that you mention, and you do go through them in a couple of these articles, where we lag behind other capitalist countries, although that's such a difficult term to define now. Would you define countries with many more social responsibilities acted upon by government capitalist?
Yes, of course. I mean, these are all market economies. Most economic activities in France or Japan or Canada is in the market between, you know, private individuals and corporations. I mean, the difference between the United States and France is the taxes are about 10% of GDP higher there. I mean, that's really not a really fundamental difference. It's just a question. They raise a little bit more money, or, you know, a lot more money, if you will, and use it to provide a bunch more services. But fundamentally, these are all capitalist economies. I think that the argument whether this is socialism or whatnot is more a kind of like a political tool that's use.
But it is indeed a political tool that's used, and a rather effective one.
Oh, indeed it is. Indeed it is. Because, again, these are countries that we have tried to define ourselves often in opposition to many of these countries, right? This is a country of individual freedoms as opposed to a country where the state has more of a say over your life. And this isn't like said with the kind of nuance that you need to understand, and because in a country like Canada, people also have lots of individual freedom, right? They just have slightly more government services, pay slightly more in taxes.
Well, I was thinking too of another piece that you wrote. I have so many of these, which I have so many questions about because they're so provocative. The one titled, Get What You Pay For, Not Always. And you go on about the most expensive election campaign in American history is over. Executives across America can now begin to assess what their companies will get in return for the roughly $2 billion spent by business interests. What do you think that assessment will be? How will it turn out?
Well, the immediate assessment will be
We
it
lost.
was a waste of money because we lost, right? Most of the money was spent to support Republican candidates or attack Democrats, and Democrats mostly held their own. So a lot of this money was wasted if it was meant to provide a winner, right, to buy a winner. But even had they won, I mean, the argument that I make in the piece, I wrote this story before I knew the results, and so my argument was that even had they won, it might be a waste of money from the point of view of the success of the companies and their shareholders.
Well, of course, you make the point, added point, that maybe it was to their detriment. What did you mean by that?
Well, there's a couple of ways that this can hurt a corporation, right? I mean, one was, I used the example of Wall Street, which I thought was pretty salient, that they spent a lot of money to help elect President Obama, and then they didn't really like what they got when the financial reform law was passed, and when President Obama kind of like acquired a more kind of aggressive rhetoric where he labeled banks as fat cats, bankers as fat cats, and so on. So suddenly, and so they flipped to Romney. So the money, presumably that they then believed that the money that they'd spent in the 2008 election was not well spent, and so now they were going to spend it well. Well, now they lost, so maybe that was not well spent either. But also more broadly, I mean, there's been a lot of analysis suggesting that the kind of this political spending does not really help corporate bottom lines. I mean, people that look at companies who spend on politics versus companies that do not spend on politics, and they try to find out, well, is this spending, does it show up in better profits or higher share prices? It does not. In fact, it often goes the other way. Companies that spend on politics do worse than companies that do not. And the example in the piece that you're referring to that I find really kind of very interesting is the story of AT&T. AT&T goes out and buys a company that pretty much any economist that knew about antitrust law that you talk to would say this deal is going to be rejected by the government because it is buying out a clear rival. You're going to reduce competition in this vital market for cellular communications. And yet AT&T went ahead with it, and it made these arguments. It was very, very confident. It was so confident that it was going to win that it promised the owner of T-Mobile, because he was going to buy T-Mobile, it promised Deutsche Telekom, who owned T-Mobile, $6 billion in breakup fees if the deal didn't go through. And the deal didn't go through. And the reason that AT&T was so confident was because of its political clout. I mean, it's one of the biggest political spenders in corporate America. And so it has lots and lots of friends on Capitol Hill and in all sorts of streets in Washington. And so it kind of like was victim to its own, overconfidence because of the political spending, I believe.
But that very point, when I read the piece, and particularly the way it started out, what did you pay for and what did you get?
Yeah.
I wondered, has the other side been just too darn worried about corporate contributions?
Well, look, it's difficult to know, right? I mean, if you look at, there's also lots of studies that suggest that spending doesn't really change electoral results that much, And this is a lot stuff that goes back a bunch of years. There's been a lot of work done on this. Does, an extra $1 million spent on this campaign gain it,
Or $50 million
or
by
50,
an individual.
And the results that come up are not really. I mean, at least not in our history. It doesn't show up in elections. And maybe this has to do with the fact that everybody is spending, And so like if one just stopped spending altogether and the other one spent $50 million, well then maybe you'd see a difference. But you get this kind of arms race, right? Where, each one moves up a notch and the other one moves up a notch. And so it would be the same if nobody spent anything at all. And it's also perhaps because, the electorate isn't that easily swayed. What you do is you convince people who are already believe, all this onslaught of advertising just convinces you of what you already think, but doesn't really change your mind. I mean, I don't know, if you live in Ohio, you were watching, I don't know how many minutes of political ads per hour, and just basically hearing the same thing over and over. Do you think that's really going to, I mean, I'm skeptical. This is not science, this is just my intuition.
Counterproductive.
Yeah, that can be counterproductive, or at least, would have diminishing returns,
Do you think my friend Floyd Abrams is going to have to go back to the Supreme Court and argue Citizens United from the other side?
Well, that would be an interesting one. I mean, I wonder, this is going to come up again to the Supreme Court, is my guess is, in some form. I mean, it seems very, very decisively decided, right? But I suspect this isn't entirely settled.
Well, nothing seems to be settled any longer at the level of the Supreme Court. I mean, there is no hard and hidebound stare decisis any longer. We can change. There were those who were worried about Roe v. Wade being overturned, etc.
Yeah.
But here I wondered, jokingly, whether corporate America might feel that it would be a lot better off if it were not possible to have this arms race.
Yeah, well, look, if they were forbidden from having this arms race, they might just save a lot of money and get the same political outcomes.
Well, that's what you were suggesting.
Yeah, so it could actually help them out, And if you talk to, there are businesses that are very thoughtful about this and have, and have pulled back on spending. And you see, in fact, a lot of businesses, after Citizens United, they put, rules on their books saying, we're not going to do independent expenditures. These outside groups that spent a lot independently on the election. A lot of that came from individuals rather than companies, because companies were a little afraid of, giving to whatever, American Crossroads or Action USA or one of those groups, because they were kind of like ceding control over their money. And they feared reputational risk and whatnot.
What about that? Do we have any information as to whether any of those fears were justified, or concerns perhaps about stockholders?
Oh, well, we have had some examples of problems. I don't know if you remember, this is vaguely in my mind. Target ran into some trouble because it spent to support a group who was spending it to support a candidate for governor who was against gay marriage. And that created a big backlash against Target. There was a threat of a boycott, and perhaps there was even a small boycott against Target. And Target kind of like, sort of like ultimately ended up passing some specific rules to kind of like guide their political giving, to limit the kind of things that they could do in the political sphere.
Do you think a corporation would do that if, under the present circumstances where they really don't have to be identified as doing what they're doing?
That's right. One of the things is that now they can put money in without anybody knowing about it. Well, yes, that will free them from this problem. But I talked to some businesses, and they were concerned over another consideration, that they could be blackmailed, because the fact that this is undisclosed, that you could donate money without telling anybody, it doesn't mean that the person that you're giving money isn't going to know. Right.
Say more.
So it can say more under the table, and so you become, the corporations were afraid that they could just be, blackmailed, extorted into giving into these independent groups.
Is there any evidence that stockholder groups have taken up the cudgels in this matter? I
don't think very aggressively. This is a young rule, right? But you have groups like the Conference Board, which groups big businesses they've issued some reports expressing concern about about Citizens United and the kind of money that it could unleash. So there is concern. I don't think it's come up to proxy votes and things like that. Real pressure against corporation spending.
Why do you think the market took such a nosedive right after the election?
You know, I wish I knew. I mean, the conventional wisdom is that they're afraid of the fiscal cliff, right? That this left our politics just as stuck as they were before the election, and hence there's a chance that that we will go over the fiscal cliff. All taxes will rise, spending cuts will be pretty draconian, and the economy will probably suffer.
You think the other capitalist countries, marketplace-driven countries, France, Germany in particular, are looking at us and wondering, what are you guys doing?
Well, I'm sure they are. Although all these countries right now have problems of their own. You know, Europe is in a tough spot. I mean, Germany is still doing reasonably well, but that's about it. You know, every other European economy is in trouble. So they've got a lot of problems of their own at the moment. So it's not like a moment for great Schadenfreude, you know, where they can look at the United States and say, well, what are these crazy folks doing? But I bet you they're worried. I mean, because if the United States economy goes south right now, the world is in pretty bad shape, and it would suffer along with us. You know, we are, of the rich economies right now, we're one of the ones that is growing, you know, faster. I mean, not that we're growing fast, but we're doing better than many others.
Globalization, I keep thinking of your colleague, Tom Friedman, who's never been here, and getting him here and saying, well, what do you think about globalization? Now, maybe it'd be better if the earth were flat. You wrote a piece not all that long ago, The Case for Raising Top Tax Rates.
Yeah.
What kind of response did you get to that?
Oh, a lot of people thought I was crazy because the tax rates that I was talking about in that story were in the 70 to 80 percentile.
But you had good basis in terms of our even recent history.
Well, yeah, that's right. That's right. I mean, I would point out two things: that we have had these tax rates in recent history, and in fact, in moments of great economic prosperity, we've had these tax rates. So the argument that tax rates at this level would destroy the economy are not supported by our history, I would say. The other point that I would like to make, too, that kind of like goes against it, is that even when we had these very high tax rates, it's not like we were raising tons more money in taxes. Because when we had these very high tax rates, we also had lots of more forms to evade them, or to avoid them, perhaps is a better word. You know, there were all these tax shelters and whatnot that were also available to people with a lot of money. And so even though the total amount of tax revenue was higher, it wasn't much, much higher. It wasn't as high as you'd think with a 75% marginal tax rate, right? But basically, the point that we can sustain these tax rates without harming the economy is that a lot of the money at the very, very high end is not necessarily creating wealth. I mean, a lot of this has to do with what's happening to the way that income is distributed in this country. A growing share has gone to the very, very, very top, right? You know, and this is a trend that has continued since about 1980 or early 1980s, late 1970s. And while we don't quite entirely understand what has been driving this, there is this sensation that the accumulation of income at the very, very top, you know, the very top, you know, bankers and businessmen and, you know, also some athletes and artists, that is not necessarily conducive to economic growth, and that you could tax away some of that without hurting economic growth. Because the standard theory says if you tax away your income, my incentive to go and get more income and be more productive is going to be, you know, attenuated, so I won't put so much effort into it, and hence the economy will grow less. But if a lot of that money there isn't really generating, you know, is really more reshuffling money within the economy rather than producing more wealth, you could tax away more of it and it will do less harm.
But you know, that's the point that puzzles me. You economic experts, people who write about economics, know that that debate is going on and has been going on in the political arena for some time now. Are there no studies that could confirm or deny the notion that up to a certain point, at any rate, taxation will not diminish investment or economic activity at some level?
well, the things, the nature of economies are very complex. And so you can put together a study that looks at, how we've had very high taxes and very high growth and how these things are not necessarily in opposition. But you will have somebody who says, well, but something was going on with immigration or something was going on with this other variable. So, the ability that economists have to clearly state a relationship like the one that you suggest is limited. It's not physics, even though economics would like to be like physics. It's not quite. It does not have these kind of decisive conclusions. And so the conclusions are always sort of up for reinterpretation and counter proposals. So, but I do think that we do have pretty substantial evidence that we could raise tax rates and the economy would not tank. But the problem is not really economic, the problem is political. Can you get through the political system? Even though you trust this proposition, can you get that proposition through the political system so that the political system accepts these tax rates? And that's when I think that we will never get tax rates anywhere near 75% or even 60% or 50%.
Do you sigh when you say that? Alas?
No, I don't really. See, when we started this conversation, talking about all these other countries that have had more robust kind of like social sectors, public social sectors, these governments don't really have super high marginal tax rates.
What's the difference then?
Well, they actually use very regressive tax systems, so very flat taxation regimes. They use consumption taxes to fund a lot of their government. So consumption taxes, they basically tax you for what you buy. At very high rates. There's the value-added tax in Britain is like above 20%, maybe 25%. And so this hits the rich and the poor, and in fact you can argue it hits the poor more because the poor spend a larger share of their income than the rich. But you can actually get a lot of money. You can actually generate a lot of tax revenue with these kind of tax systems. So what the European system has done, or other systems that use consumption taxes, is we're going to take tax money from everybody, not just the rich. We're going to take a lot of tax money from the middle class and the rich and the poor, and we're going to use this to fund universal services that are going to be more highly valued by the poor than by the rich because the poor need them more.
More next time, and you have to come back and talk further. Thank you so much for joining me
Thanks
today.
very much for having me. It was great.
And thanks to you in the audience. I hope you join us again next time. Meanwhile, as an old friend used to say, good night and good luck. And do visit the Open Mind website at 13.org/openmind to reprise this program online right now, or to draw upon our archive of 1,500 or so other Open Mind and related programs. That's 13.org/openmind. Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the Bluestein Family Foundation, the Joan Gans CUNY and Peter G. Peterson Fund, Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Malkin Fund, the May and Samuel Rudin Family Foundation, the Joanne and Kenneth Wellner Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America.